Item 10, sure. Yeah.
Because you haven't had enough fun with the actuaries, you're going to have more. So this is another one of the items where, again, this is a first reading. We are not recommending it be adopted. This is really more for internal discussion. Have some, and then get some direction so that you can possibly adopt it, a policy in February, which would then be incorporated into the board policy manual. The other thing, before I turn it over to Mark and Nick, I also just want to let people know this is a very complicated situation with respect to how we do valuations now under the new funding bill, and the discussion is based entirely on this is what the bill says. It may not necessarily be the logical way of doing things, and so I think as you have discussions around it, you may identify things that perhaps need to be tweaked in terms of how. Not necessarily the overall funding of it, but in terms of how responsibilities get allocated amongst the different parties. So let me turn it over to Mark and Nick, and they can sort of walk their way through it.
Great. If I can do that clicker there. Yes, we're going to talk to you about the actuarial valuation policy associated with AB 1469. First of all, AB 1469 is a beautiful thing because it funds teachers' benefits, but it comes at a price which you're about to pay, which is learning about talking about the implementation policies associated with it. That's right. I love the attitude. Teachers have great attitudes. So, yeah, this is, as a matter of fact, this is probably the most difficult thing I've had to explain to a board in my entire career, and that's not hyperbole. That's really not hyperbole.
Oh, great.
And it's 4 o'clock and you expect us to.
So just before we dig too deep, I want to point out what's the most confusing thing, which is that the state is responsible for the 1990 benefit structure. In other words, the state is responsible for what if no changes had been made after 1990. Well, two things happened. Contributions were lowered and benefits were increased, which means if those changes hadn't happened, we estimate the system would have about $15 billion more in assets at June 30, 2014 than it does. Well, if the state's not responsible for those $15 billion in assets, who is? And that's an interesting question. The second thing it does is it makes the districts, yeah, we'll get back to that. That's a very interesting thing. That's $15 billion more than's in the pot right now. The state's getting credit essentially for $15 billion that doesn't exist, because it would have existed if those contributions had been made, if those benefits had not been increased.
Nick, would you hold on for a second? Tom?
So how is it, and maybe this has long been covered and everybody else knows it, but how is it that 1990 is the benchmark of the state's obligation?
Ed might actually give a better
Well,
answer
that's what the statute says. I mean, that's sort of the legal reason. The statute says this division is based on benefits in effect in 1990. 1990 was the year that the last funding program was enacted. That became the benchmark. You'll recall that in the last couple of years when we've done valuations, there was a contribution the state paid, and then there was a smallly increase in those contributions. That was also based on there being an unfunded liability associated with the 1990 benefits.
The root of it, to the extent there's an underfunding in the real world,
Right.
that's a full faith and credit obligation of the state.
It's not suggesting that the ultimate, when push comes to shove, legal responsibility. That's how the bill allocates the financial aspects of how to pay it.
And it's actually consistent with the law that was in place before AB 1469, which required the state to increase its contributions. But that's the reason I bring that up first, is because if we can't get past that, and it's not easy to get past that, the whole thing doesn't make sense. If you can get past that, the next hurdle, which I don't believe is as high but is still a hurdle, is the fact that the districts are going to be responsible for the remaining unfunded actuarial obligation, which is allocated to pre-2014 service. So now we've got unfunded obligations for service before a certain date. We're not sure what happens to the unfunded obligations for service after that date. So with that introduction, yes.
Raise a question.
So Mark, I think when you introduced the pre-1990 stuff, you had said that that was due to a benefit increase. What benefit increase happened pre-1990 that Because when we have members that think that the enhancements that came at the end of the 1990s screwed stuff up.
Those are the enhancements. They happened after 1990, so those enhancements increased the benefits going out, and because the benefits going out were larger, the assets that were remaining were smaller.
Right, but isn't the extra funding for the benefits that were in existence in 1990? So I don't see the tie between the enhancements at the end of the 90s and the benefits that were in existence at 1990.
Yeah, this is extremely confusing, and if
Okay.
either Nick or Ed wants to jump in, that's great too, but
Want to give it a shot? Okay, so what the bill is saying is that the state is responsible for the unfunded liability associated with the benefit plan in effect in 1990. So, but to the extent, so what they're looking at is what are the assets and liabilities that we would have had now if there had been no change made to benefits or contributions after 1990. The benefits increased after 1990. The contributions went down for 10 years after 1990. Therefore, the assets that we actually have and are lower than what they would have been if those changes had never taken effect.
So it's not just the enhancement, but it's also the lowering of the contribution
For
rate
those
by the
10 years.
state.
Yeah, no, the lowering the contribution to the members because it went to DBS
Yeah.
for
Yep.
10 years.
yeah, particularly the 2% of
And
member.
the fact that the state
No,
lowered
because that
their
was never entered into the
contribution rate.
calculation. We didn't, the state's well, I guess, I don't know if you do it now, but you didn't, under the old funding mechanism, we didn't look at the state's contribution, but the primary reason was because of the 2% redirection to DBS.
Actually, I mean, that's true. That's one big piece. The other big piece is that basically the law says we have to take into account the unfunded actual obligation as if there were no changes in benefits and contributions, as Ed said. So when we create these assets of market we're talking about, we say instead of taking out the full benefit payments, we only take out the benefit payments based on the 1990 benefit structure. So we're taking out, as Ed said, we assume those contributions didn't come over, and also we take out smaller benefit amounts. So we're like tracking this going forward, which it obviously gets there, and there's a number of other things, but those are the two big things. Because if the benefit enhancement had not occurred, the assets would be larger for those two main reasons, because you'd have lower benefit payments and you'd had higher contributions.
Okay, so my great concern is that then, because there's a focus on this, once again, that the general public is going to think that the reason we have an unfunded liability is the benefit enhancements.
What happened in
Right.
2000.
Well,
I mean, it's just the perception that people are gonna get, so I just want, I think we need to lay it out there, because that's not the major reason why we have the issue with the unfunded liability, but that's not how the public's gonna perceive it, so.
yeah, I mean, we're just reacting to what
I know.
the specific
I
words
know.
in the law, okay.
Yeah, we're just reacting to it.
No, I
too.
appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Nick.
Certainly.
Thank you, Dana.
So now that we've talked about, and we're going to keep coming back to those concepts. I wanted to get them out there in the first place because we're going to keep coming back to that. So we've got the provisions of the new law. The 2% annual benefit adjustment was vested. Contributions went up for members and the state and the districts. And we have three key decision points. The first one is the difficult one, allocating the assets and the liabilities to the state and the districts. That becomes very difficult when we're looking at changes made after 1990 and things allocated to service before 2014. The amortization period for the state contributions needs to be determined because the legislation does not specifically state over what period the state will pay for the 1990 benefit structure, although it does say that the state's responsibilities expire after 2048. Or not the responsibilities, but the legislation itself, excuse me, not the responsibility, the legislation itself expires after 2046. And then whether to use market or actuarial value of assets. So we'll be going over those. But the first one is the real sticking point. This is just a quick slide showing the increases. Yes.
I'm sorry. I just want to make
Sharon?
sure, it's 46.
46.
Right, and you had said 48 first and then, okay, I just wanted to make sure. And it's like a timeline would be great, you know, sort of like 1990, and then the benefit enhancements, that was 2000, right, 2000?
One in 1998 and one in 2000.
Okay, and then, okay, got it. I just wanted to make sure I had the dates right.
Yeah, in 2046, please. For,
So the amortization period for state contributions is not specified in the law, but it is for the districts?
correct. The districts, it states 2046. And the state, it does not specify when. One might infer by the fact that the legislation expires in 2046 that the state should have paid it off by then, but that's not specifically stated. So, the rates go up. This chart just shows the increases in both the district and the state rates. By the way, I feel like I should apologize to you. You've had a long day already, and to get something like this at the end of it must be a real,
That's why you're
real
gonna give
treat.
us a nice summary of the presentation, Nick. Nice summary of the deck.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, look forward to talking to you in February.
That's close.
Okay, yes, we do want to, you may think that by the end of this presentation that we don't like AB 1469. We love it because it provides funding. It's just very complicated. Before AB 1469, we were projecting the trust would run out of money in 2046. Now it says we'll be 100% funded as of 2046 if all the assumptions are met. This sets us aiming at the target at what should be the right cost level. What we know is that there will be experience either better or worse, and contributions will have to be adjusted. That's a second thing which is good about AB 2046, is it actually gives the ability to make some adjustment to the contributions made by the state and the districts. This is the whole issue about the 1990 benefit structure. As a matter of fact, we'll sometimes talk about the 1990 assets. We don't mean the assets at 1990. We mean the assets which would have accumulated if changes had not been made after 1990. This shows that at the time of the 2013 valuation, if you look at the bars on the left, based on the 1990 benefit structure, the assets would have accumulated to about 160 billion. That's in the green on the bottom. On the other hand, the total, the actual assets, the bar on the right, there was about 150 billion. So at that point, there was a difference of roughly $10 billion. That's actually part of the current valuation. That was part of the 2013 valuation. We were already looking at, does the state's contribution rate have to go up before AB 1469 based on obligations for things that were in place as of 1990, both contributions and benefits in place. And what we did in that valuation is we looked at the 1990 actuarial obligation that was defined as based on the benefit structure in place at 1990. We looked at the assets that would have accumulated if the changes had not been made, and we looked at the difference between those two to determine whether or not the state's contribution rate had to go up. And with that, I will turn it over to Nick as it's not going to get better after this point, guys. But ask us questions, ask us questions.
Asking him the presentation when it gets complicated.
I didn't mean it that way. What I meant is Nick's the smart one, so he gets the tough part.
Yeah, well, one of the great things about being a public plan actuary is there's always something we can lose sleep over. For years, as Mark talked about it, we fretted over the underfunding, and now we get a new thing to lose sleep over, which is not how it's funded, but how we have to explain it and how we have to implement it. And so that's what we're going to try and go through. So really, as Mark talked about, the language in the old law had to split, and this looks somewhat similar, except for different colors of what Mark had, is that we have the state, the 1990 benefit structure, and now we have the district, the pre-2014 service total actual obligation. Now one difference there is that now under the law, that this piece, the total obligation, total unfunded actual obligation has been assigned to the district, and the 1990 benefit structure had already been effectively assigned to the state. Obviously, the second key difference is now the total unfunded actual liability that we're paying off is pre-2014 service, and that really sort of complicates things if they weren't complicated enough. The second thing I would add there is technically the law just says that districts are responsible for paying off the total unfunded actual obligation, which sort of implies that, and these numbers I have are the 2013 valuation, and if you look at that yellow piece that's unfunded, that's actually $70 billion. But we also know the state is on the hook over here on the left-hand side for the $20 billion. So I'm going to go through a bunch of gyrations, but the point you're going to end up with is that we're going to say the district's going to be on the hook for the $50 billion, and the state is going to be on the hook for the 20 billion unfunded, and however that may change in the future. And that is where the complexity comes in, and because of this, we have to now allocate between pre-2014 service and post-2014 service. Before to get into anything else, we haven't talked about the members. Well, the members are kicking in some extra money, but they don't have to worry about, we don't have to worry about them, and they don't have to worry about us because they're fixed. They have a fixed graded schedule, and then boom, that's what they're going to pay. So we're not going to tell them to pay anything different. And so we can, well, that's one thing where we don't have a variable that, you know, it's one piece that is actually fixed. So if you remember, I had blue and yellow, so I've put them together, and you see that we have blue, yellow, and green because a piece of this actually overlapped, which was the law talks about the 1990 benefit structure, and it talks about talks about, it doesn't split the service, it's all service, whereas the district piece is only pre-2014 service, so that obviously adds a little complexity is how we deal with this one part that, you know, both people are sort of responsible to. And I've kind of alluded to that. We're just going to take the blue and the green, which is the old blue, which is the 1990 benefit structure, and we're going to put that to the state. And then the yellow piece, which is basically effectively the new benefits, the actual obligation for the benefit enhancements that took place in 1990 and 2000. And we're going to assign that to the districts. You notice there's one last piece, which is space 4, which there's not really any funding set aside specifically to pay off any unfunded for that. But what we're going to do in the valuation is we're not going to concentrate on that piece, but we're going to look at the funding in total, because ultimately that's what really matters is, do we have enough funding in total? You know, we have to deal with these individual pieces, but the ultimate question is the funding in total. So we'll look at that just as a measure to see how we're progressing. So I'm not going to spend very much time on this. This is the funding of the 1990 benefit structure.
Continue, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Paul?
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Names. Nick and Mark's
Yeah,
names
yeah,
are
there's
switched.
switch there.
Oh,
Yeah.
Good,
We
Paul.
weren't already
So-
confused.
What is that column, the white and the blue post 2014 service?
I mean, you're going to have, you know, not with this valuation, but in future
Right.
valuations, you're going to have liabilities
Right,
for
right.
service that occurs after 2014. Now, the state, according to the law, is on the hook for unfunded actual obligation for the 1990 benefit structure. So we read that as there's no differentiation on pre-2014 or post-2014 service. So basically, that actual obligation falls on the state's shoulders.
Here's my question then. So this, these numbers on the vertical axis
yeah.
apply to the pre-2014, they don't apply to the post.
Right, yeah, if you, that blue,
that's all
that blue doesn't really
That's all.
exist at this
Got it.
point.
That's
Yes,
all
that, yeah.
That's what confused me.
Perfect. So funding in 1990 benefit structure, Mark has already talked about it, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I would just, you know, remind you that this is the assets as if the 1990 benefit structure and contributions had always applied, and obviously the benefits as if, so the actual obligation as if the 1990 benefit structure had always applied. Now, on the assets, the one thing, you know, we talked about the, you know, what the contributions were, you know, back when, but obviously we're going to incorporate the additional contributions in the assets because obviously the state's making these extra contributions. So if we don't include those in the assets, you know, theoretically they're not going to pay off their unfunded actual obligation. So we have included that. That wasn't totally clear from the law, but I think that is clearly the intent. And so this is so now we've got the 1990 benefit structure. Now we need to split out the piece that's a district. So we already know what the states is, and if you read 22955.1, it talks about the state contribution rates. So it's citing subdivision B, which is the state contribution rates, the increased ones, shall not be construed to be applicable to any unfunded actual obligation resulting from any benefit increase or change in member or employer contribution rate under this part that occurs after July 1, 1990. The key there is any employer contribution rate. So basically what what that means to us is the state has to take care of the 1990 benefit structure first, because it's irrespective of any changes in the employer contribution rate. And then the last piece is going to be the district, which is they're going to pick up the rest of the pre-2000 unfunded actuarial obligation. So how do we calculate that? We need to calculate the unfunded actuarial obligation for the total benefit. Then we need to calculate the unfunded actuarial obligation for pre-2014 service for the state, and the what's left over falls on the district contribution rates. So that's really a lot of what Mark talked about. The last piece, well, the next piece of complexity is that using pre-2014 service, stopping service at a specific point in time is not compatible with the entry age normal cost method, which public plan actuaries love. And I'm going to talk about why we like that, because of the way it allocates benefits to service. It allocates it, over an entire member's career. And so we're going to recommend using the projected unit credit normal cost method, and I'll talk about what that is real briefly.
Not for the whole valuation, just for this one piece.
Yes. Not for the total evaluation, we continue to use entry age, but for this one piece with the district contribution rate, we're going to use the projected unit credit normal cost method. And that, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going into details, but the key thing there is you see that blue line? That is why we like to use the normal cost. That is the normal cost rate as a percentage of pay over a member's career if a member behaves exactly like the actuaries would like them to. And you can see. Pardon?
How's that working out?
It's actually really good. If you look at our report, you'll see that every year the normal cost rate stays pretty steady. But yeah, it's the assets that don't behave exactly the way the actuaries like. But so. But the point is that, so we have this nice flat thing, and because basically we say, we look at an entire member's career and then we kind of go back so that everything is nice and level. But the problem is if we have to cut off service at a specific date, that doesn't work, because under the entry age normal cost method, we're going to be pushing costs into the future. And I think that's not consistent with the concept of stopping service at July 1st, 2014.
Yeah, the entry age normal cost method does not allocate benefits, it allocates costs. And that becomes a problem when the unfunded obligation is based on service before a certain date.
Yeah. Whereas the projected unit credit method would just have costs all the way up until the service stopped, and then it would go to zero. So projected unit cost method makes sense. I'd be happy to take more questions on it, but as we don't have to deal with this right now. I'll keep moving along, okay? In the deference of brevity. So as I said, to calculate the unfunded actual obligation attributable to the district, we take the total one, and then we need to do the one for the 1990 benefit structure, which is attributable to the state. So then we're going to back that out, and this is kind of the details on it. And I should have said our letter that you have has nice details. If you're ever having trouble getting to sleep, you can read through it. But it has a detailed procedure. And I would say, I think we're going to have somebody come in, and we're going to have another actuary at some point. We're going to have an audit in about 2000, in a year or two, right, Rick? Yeah, so we'll have another, before this is actually implemented, we'll have another actuary come in and entertain you more, but they can opine. The key thing is they can opine upon this, because as Mark said, this was, we banged it around quite a bit to come up with what we thought was the not necessarily the best approach, but the approach that was most consistent and made sense based on what was said in the legislation. So you will get a second opinion, and we'll be able to run through this for a valuation or two before we actually start adjusting the contribution rates, which really matters.
Yeah, there's actually three things we like. It provides assets, it provides the ability for the contribution rates to change, but they don't change until the 2017, 2018 year, so we have time to get it all worked out.
So, this is where you're going to say, now, Nick, why did you go through all this? Because if you look at this, the graph on the left, it is a whole lot like where we started out with. And really, pre-2014, as of the 2014 valuation, not much is going to have changed. It's really when we go forward and we have to start doing those allocations between the pre-2014 service and the post-2014 service that it gets a little complicated. So this should look a whole lot like the very first slide that I started with, but you can see we've allocated the UAO, which I alluded to originally, as $50 billion for the districts and $20 billion for the state, and that was obviously numbers as of 2013. That's going to change as of 2014 when we actually do the valuation. So that was item 1. Now, item 2 and item 3 that we need to address are a lot quicker. Mark already alluded to the funding for the 1990 benefit structure. It doesn't say how that funding is supposed to take place. It does say the section becomes inoperative in June 30, 2046, which sort of alludes to the fact that we would want to pay it off by June 30, 2046. So you might say we'd have a closed amortization period and we'd set up the rates so we'd have level rates to pay off by June 30, 2046. The problem with that is whenever you have a closed period and you get down very short, it makes contribution rates very volatile. At this point, we're not that concerned with that. I mean, our recommendation here is kind of wait, maybe we're looking about maybe 10 years and kind of see where everything's at, and then make that decision then, because the volatility is toward the end of the period, so we're really in no rush to make that decision. So that was item 2. Item 3 Mark alluded to is if you remember when we were doing the 2013 evaluation, we effectively used market value of assets when we were having that recommendation for the contribution rate. And we did that because we only had kind of one shot to tell people how much money we needed. And if we knew we were deferring $10 billion in losses, which we were at some point, then we would, we'd get this funding solution. And then we would be coming back and saying, well, yeah, that's inadequate. So that's why we did what we did before. But now we would recommend using the actuarial value of assets, which is smooth, because we actually have the ability to adjust contribution rates going forward, whereas before we just had kind of a one-time shot. So that's the last thing. We're recommending using the actuarial value of assets when calculating the contribution rates, and we'll review that with our experience study that we do in 2016 to make sure that what we're recommending makes sense for the situation. And with that, I will turn it to Mark.
All right, so key concepts. Well, first, the districts are not responsible for funding the 1990 benefit structure. Similarly, the state is not responsible for the funding of new benefits. And when we say new benefits, we mean benefits which were improved after 1990. Now, one potential situation is that we run into a situation where there's a surplus for the 1990 benefits, but not for the state. Well, if we ignore the 1990 structure, then the districts might be on the hook for funding an unfunded liability which is greater than the total unfunded liability. Our interpretation is that neither party, neither the districts nor the state at any point in time should be responsible for funding a liability greater than the total unfunded liability that's out there simply because of the way things have been carved up. That's actually consistent with what's been done in the past. It's interesting to note that because essentially all of the assets, as a matter of fact, more than all of the assets have been allocated to the state contribution is the one which has the most volatility. The state's unfunded liability has the most volatility. This chart looks historically at the unfunded liability which would have been allocated to the state, that's the blue, based on the 1990 benefit structure, and the remaining unfunded liability, which we could say is allocated to the districts. You'll notice that the new unfunded liability, the unfunded liability not attached to the 1990 benefit structure, has increased monotonically. Actuaries like words like that. It's increased steadily every year. You could almost draw a straight line through the top of the green bars. However, the blue has changed quite a bit. Back in 2007, there was a surplus based on the 1990 benefit structure, so we see a negative unfunded actuarial obligation. Then 2008, there was a small negative or a small surplus. Suddenly after 2008, no surprise, bad return, we see a large unfunded actuarial obligation for the state. The asset returns are impacting almost entirely the state's 1990 unfunded actuarial obligation, almost not at all the districts, because almost all the assets have been allocated to the 1990 benefit structure.
That's a good chart.
Thank you.
And Harry, if I can, that sort of speaks to the concern that Dana was expressing, is that, we don't talk about it in this thing, but because, you're saying it looks like the benefits are what's caused the unfunded liability. If we had never made a change in the benefit structure, we would have been super funded. But because of what happened to the market, that's why we ended up where we did. And that's not reflected in any of these numbers that you've seen.
But in this,
Except
Sorry,
here.
it tells us right
That
there.
tells it to you right
tells us
there,
right
yeah.
That's good. What the cause was.
Well, if it isn't strange enough already, we want to look at the numbers that we already looked at. So if we go back to 2013, the total fund had about 220 million in actuarial obligation, 150 billion, I think I said million a moment ago, I'd like to say one thing, but billion in assets, which means that the total unfunded actuarial obligation was about $70 billion. Now, based on the 1990 benefit structure, the actuarial obligation would have only been 180 billion, so 40 billion less. We can see the new benefits would have been 40 billion. The assets, though, and this is getting back to that strange thing, the assets would have been about $10 billion larger due to additional contributions that weren't made or that were diverted into the DBS. They weren't made into the DB fund, and larger benefits, which were subtracted out, meaning that there's only an unfunded actuarial obligation of $20 billion. The difference then between the 70 billion total UAO and the 20 billion allocated to 1990 is a 50 billion that's left for the new benefits allocated to the state. Now, the 40 billion in actuarial obligation makes sense. That's the obligation in excess of the 1990 benefit structure. The 50 billion seems to make sense because it's the difference between a 70 billion UAO and a 20 billion UAO. But the interesting thing is the assets, because if we look at the difference in the assets, what it has effectively done, and again, we keep going back to that, we're just reading the law, but it essentially allocates a negative 10 billion in assets to whoever is responsible for the new benefits, which would seem to be the districts, Now, let's look, this is I was saying if things aren't strange enough, let's look at the impact now of good experience. Let's say we had a 10% gain in assets. We had a return 10% larger than we were anticipating, not 7.5, but 17.5. Well, the assets, instead of being 150 billion, might have been 15 billion larger, so that goes up from 150 billion to 165 billion. The obligations stay at the same level, 220, so now we only have a total unfunded actuarial obligation of 55 billion. Well, what about the 1990 assets? They were 160 billion. Remember, 10 of that's fictitious, but they were 160 billion. It's not just the 150 that gets credit. That fictitious 10 also gets credit because if those contributions had actually been made, if they had actually been in there, they'd be getting that return. So that 160 billion is going to go up by 16 billion to 176 billion. And well, if we look at the difference between the 165 and the 176, that means that this good return must have made the new benefits even further behind at, instead of $10 billion, $11 billion. Or if you want to look at it in the strangest possible way, you could say that negative $10 billion asset, which probably is a difficult thing to get your mind around in the first place. Well, when we increase negative 10 by 10%, it goes up to be, or goes down to be negative 11. So the 1990 obligation has gone down from 20 billion to 4 billion, and the new benefit obligation allocated to the districts has gone up, good experience, gone up from 50 billion to 51 billion. Good experience to a certain point increases the obligation for the new benefits because somewhere the good experience on that $10 billion that doesn't exist, that has to come from somewhere. Now, you may have another idea. That's why we're trying to make this clear what happened, some very strange results. We don't have another way of looking that we've come up with to look at this. And if you look at the contribution rates on the bottom, again, the biggest impact is on the state. if we were to amortize the unfunded over 30 years, the state's contribution went from 3.94% of pay down to 0.79% of pay, a large reduction. The new benefit, Harry,
Paul and Joy.
yes.
So, yeah, I spent a lot of time looking at this chart in the board materials. So, we've got the actuarial obligation minus the assets equals the unfunded actuarial obligation. So, two of those numbers have to have come from somewhere else, and then the third can be a plug figure, right?
Yes.
So which are the two numbers that came from somewhere else, and where did they come from?
Is it too much for me to ask which column you want me to respond to on that?
one of them.
Okay, I'll look at the first one, the actual total fund.
Right.
So what we did is we, as actuaries, looked at all the benefits. We applied our 7.5% assumption. We calculated for the actuarial obligation. We calculated $220 billion. The assets are essentially what comes from the audit of the fund, although we've added some smoothing in there. So by that definition, the UAO would be the plugged number.
Go to the next two columns, because that's where it maybe is a little bit more.
The next two columns, okay, well, the next column, I won't get into too much trouble, I think, until the third column. But if we go to the next column, the 1990 benefit structure, again, we're able to take real data from real members.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Assumptions, I don't know if you want to call our assumptions real or whatever, but best estimate assumptions, we calculate 180 billion. The 160 billion, that's getting to be a little bit more tenuous. I don't know if I can call that real, although to the extent that we make a certain set of assumptions for contributions that would have gone into the trust that otherwise would not have, that we apply the actual investment returns for past years which would have accrued on those contributions if they had been deposited in the trust. It's a real would have number. What's a real would have number?
So,
But it's-
but it's not just,
Scientific.
Yeah.
it's not just then the funds that would have gone in, I mean, it's also the funds that would have come out, right? I mean,
Yes,
it's
both.
the net cash flow.
It's the funds that would have gone in, the funds that would have come out, and the investment income which would have been earned.
Would have been earned.
on
Okay,
those
so-
funds. A
so-
lot of would haves.
So basically, the 180 and the 160 are calculated numbers.
Yeah, I would say
The
yes.
220 and the 150 are calculated numbers, and everything else is calculated from those four numbers.
I like that way of looking at it.
Thank you. Just wanted to see how you were doing.
Fighting actuary.
Paul's really good about asking the questions to force us to clarify things.
Joy?
But are other questions on this before I go on to the next
Joy-
slide?
Joy Higgins.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Joy.
so just to make sure that I followed, that helped with the dialogue with Paul just now, but so to get to the third column of new benefits, that's just the difference between total fund and 1990 benefit structure.
Yes.
And then the contribution percentages that you've got on the last row, the 3.94 would be the state's contribution percentage because it's for the 1990 benefit structure,
Yes.
and the 9.85 for the districts.
Yes, and specifically, not based on the contribution rates in AB 1469, but assuming we were going to pay it off over 30 years, which is actually a little bit less than 2046. But it's also not taking in those graded increases.
It's 20 to 5. We have we have some closed session items. We have, Brian's got a presentation to us, so it is 20 to 5. If you guys could kind of.
We got one key thing that we
Okay.
didn't want to talk about.
I hate to be the horse here, but the increase in assets, that's total increase in assets. So for example, this last year where we've had a very good investment year but still had negative cash flow, this whole thing doesn't come into play, right? In other words, it's assets as opposed to returns.
Well, returns impact assets.
Right,
So,
but so do payouts.
Yeah, I mean, this actually is a fairly good barometer of what your 18% return, if we did everything on a market basis, how it would look. I mean, the state's rate, the state's rate was based on June 30th, 2013. If we projected it forward, the 18%, it would be a lot less if we did everything at June 30, 2014 and calculated, because as Mark showed, that unfunded went down a lot.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, what happens, what's the impact of the in fact, negative cash flow in the fund? Investment gain notwithstanding.
What do you mean by the negative cash flow?
Well, we pay out more in benefits than we generated in cash.
I mean, it applies fairly evenly to the two assets. Is that kind of how it affects our hypothetical assets and the actual assets?
It's more or less incorporated into this because to the extent
Well,
that benefits come out of the assets.
I think this is a pretty good sense of the numbers, but in June of 13,
Oh,
I think
yeah.
the total number, assets of the fund were roughly, they weren't 220, they were roughly 160, 165, is that about right?
Yeah, we
20 is the obligation, not the asset.
Yeah.
Right.
But, our total assets were roughly 170.
And this
yeah,
shows-
that had the DBS. I think that number has the DBS and the CBB and stuff in it.
Okay, so then take it down to 160.
Then the SBMA, you take it down to, that's where like we came up with the 150.
Okay, 150, start there. Then we had a good investment year, but we also paid out a lot of cash.
Yeah.
Now, does the state get the benefit for the payout of the cash, which I think was roughly comparable to the actual cash in investment gain? We had some investment markups.
Yeah, there's gonna be a difference in these numbers in 6/30/2014, but the relative difference between the numbers should be in that ballpark.
Okay, so that,
So maybe, Tom, I can help. These are the net assets of the plan. So it's the bottom.
bottom
So-
assets,
right.
after cash distributions. right.
Yeah.
And is it taking into account unrealized gains as if they're real assets?
Yes.
Okay.
And Robin, I asked you to come up because it's to Tom's point, we had this conversation, I think, 1 or 2 meetings ago, relative to the negative cash flow. And I always looked at what we receive in terms of contributions by our 3 sources,
Right.
which is about $5.5 billion, and we paid out in benefits between 10 and 11 billion.
11 billion,
I
right.
always looked at that as minus 500 million a month, or about $5 to $6 billion a year. You helped me to understand a little bit further that with the dividends that we receive and other cash contributions, can you elaborate a little bit? Because
So-
I might
so that-
not be the
that-
only one who was thinking that way.
Right, so that's if you don't consider reinvesting, the reinvestment of the realized income on investments. So
Right.
it really is, that is based on the assumption that you are allowing for the reinvestment of all your realized returns. So there is, that negative cash flow we talk about is based on the fact that we have allocated monies into investments and we're going to continue to reinvest those realized gains. So we're not pulling those out.
It's not real
Yeah.
negative cash flow.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so that's what's confusing.
Yeah. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah,
Thanks,
no,
Robin.
and that's something we want to get better at sharing with you, is those, we haven't done those kinds of cash flow statements, and that's, we want to get better at that, so you can see clearly that there are differences. We have that monthly negative based on new cash, what I'll call new cash.
Thanks, Robin. Anything else, Tom, that you wanted to?
No.
Okay. Paul? Paul?
Yeah, thank you. So,
Thanks,
again,
Robin.
on this chart, so, and I may be getting ahead of something you've got further on here, but, from reading the materials. So if we had a 15% asset gain rather than a 10% asset gain, is that where you're gonna get to?
That's a beautiful question.
Okay, so if we had a 15% asset gain, the 1990 benefit structure would have assets of 184 billion.
Right.
And so the UAO would be a -4, but I think your write-up suggested it could never go below 0. And I wanted to understand, is that dictated by the law? And if it's not, what's the thinking about that? Since it seems to me that if we then had a subsequent negative return, that UAO could return.
Here's what our thinking was, is if you read the law, I mean, it talks about the 1990 benefit structure, but it also talks about the total, unfunded actual obligation, which, basically says it's the district, but as I said, we said, well, the district's, the state's gonna pay a piece of it, and the district's gonna pay the rest. Well, if the state's theoretical piece is overfunded by $4 billion, the total piece, that there's effectively a $4 billion credit. Now, if the state, so that means that sort of the district would sort of get this credit and not have to pay as much in the short term, because we wouldn't be projecting to pay off the total unfunded actual obligation. The contribution rate in play should pay off the total unfunded actual obligation. We're not going to have, the district paying extra to pay it down earlier. We're just trying to pay off the total piece. Now, if the state, drops out of that unfunded situation, then, that credit kind of goes away for the district and their rate would go up. And then the state, any additional contributions would, proceed as usual. Does that help?
To some extent.
Yeah, except I'm not sure whether the adjustment from the state then is from 0 or from -4 in my example.
Well, basically, I mean, we're not technically adjusting for the -4, but we're looking at the total piece. I mean, what do we need? What is the district? We're saying, hey, the state is now overfunded. They don't have to, they don't have to make a contribution according to AB 1469. So they're out. Now we're saying, what does the district have to contribute to pay off the total unfunded actual obligation? I mean,
That makes sense at that point. What I'm
Yeah.
saying is, we're remeasuring it every year. In other words, once the state gets down to 0, the state's not completely off the hook, right?
Right, yeah,
I
if
mean,
they
if
pop
that-
back up is
if
our
that-
understanding.
Right, so if it comes back up, does the state essentially get to, in my example, claw back that $4 billion that was credited to the district?
Well, I mean,
I think we keep maintaining the assets and the liabilities for the 1990 benefit structure, even when the assets are larger.
Yeah.
And so as long as the assets are larger, the state doesn't have an extra contribution, but at some point in the future, I mean, we're still doing the same thing to the assets.
yeah, I think an easy example is what if it was $4 billion and then there was a $4 billion and $1 loss. Now the state would be on the hook for $1, not $4 billion, not $4 billion and $1. So they're effectively getting that credit in that they've got that buffer, that that they've got their assets are greater than their liabilities. So if they get losses, they're getting that credit. And when they actually pop out, they're not going to pop out. If there's a $10 billion loss, but they started off at a $5 billion surplus, they're only going to end up having to owe $5 billion, not $10 billion.
To some extent, the districts get.
That's what I was trying to understand, because it wasn't clear to me in the.
Yeah, they're not going to lose that. It's not like we're taking that money and
That's
transferring it over.
Yeah, it was
no,
unclear
no.
to me in reading.
It's only
it.
a temporary,
I
yeah.
was just interested in the clarification on that. Thank you.
Good clarification.
And it's not directly germane to what you're just discussing, but I just make sure the board's aware of the fact that if we get to the point where the state has actually, where the 1990 unfunded liability is actually paid off, the state's contribution would still be in place, but only at the 2.017 level, which is the baseline.
Right.
So it never completely goes away.
Right.
It just doesn't, there's just no increment to fund the unfunded liability.
I just, whenever by the time we get to the point of adopting something, I'd like it to be as clear as possible.
Yeah, no, I agree.
That's all
I
the
agree.
reason
I
I'm
just want to make
asking
sure
these
this
questions.
this is all
So we
new
don't,
stuff
so
to
we don't have to
everybody.
come back to it.
Okay.
That's a fair request.
Thank you.
Nick and I conferred, we think we've gone over the really important material here. We do have more, but this is really you've heard all the most important things.
No. Thank you, gentlemen.
And I just summarize, there are some things that probably seem counterintuitive, but the funding we believe works. It's not anything inherently wrong with it. We just want you to be aware of the implications and sort of digest it, and we can talk about it at a future date.
You're getting used to the idea of who is responsible for the money that doesn't exist. And how do we carve up obligations so that some of them are allocated for service before 2014? Those are the things that make this the most difficult.
So, but talk about what will February look like, just so we can finish it. So we're talking about coming back in February with actually a policy for adoption, right?
So what February would look like would be very similar to the last, I think it's 3 or 4 pages of the agenda
Right.
item, where we have a lot of detail in these charts. I mean, we're really, this is, what's the last 2 pages? We're really not planning on changing any of this. And you could put it in any, you could either say this is the way we think it should be administered in the future, or you should say we want Milliman to, first of all, no contributions will actually be changed on this until fiscal year 2017-18. So you could say we want Milliman to proceed with this understanding, but we will review it on an annual basis to see how comfortable we are. We will have the next audit look very seriously at this to see how comfortable.
Next actuarial audit.
Next actuarial audit, thank you. Look at this to see how comfortable we are with it. I think you have some options open to you on what exact action you take, particularly because it, again, it doesn't change any contribution rates until fiscal year 2017-18.
Well, actually, Jack asked the question I was going to be, what was the action item going to be? But I can already tell that you gave us the answer, which is we should continue to look at it.
Sharon?
Well, I spent part of my day talking to both Mark and Nick yesterday, and I do really appreciate, I think this stuff is complex, and even what you said, Mark, about even this conversation being challenging for you, which says a lot, since I'm sure you've seen a lot of things in your day with all the different institutional investors you guys work with. And so I do just want to thank you, because I do think we have great consultants and staff, because this is complex. And so I appreciate your patience and time. And then I think you guys are really effective in communicating clearly things that are really challenging to understand. So I appreciate your work with us, your partnership with us to understand the complexity of this, and we'll keep moving forward together in our understanding of these issues. So just appreciate you talking to us today.
Thanks, Sharon. Dana?
Thank you.
And I fully appreciate that we're going to keep talking about it. And I can't even believe that I might even suggest this. If we are doing our valuations on an annual basis, are you thinking about presenting our next valuation with this type of detail?
We would like to include this in the next valuation, and we could provide as much detail as the board wanted. You might actually want to review this after the valuation and to focus just on this policy, because this doesn't change the primary
Absolutely.
actuarial valuation.
Absolutely.
So we might, the board could say, let's look at the valuation as usual in April, not really considering this. Milliman, why don't you come back at the next meeting
And show us what it would have been
us
if this was all in effect at the time. Because I'm hypersensitive to the media picking up stuff out of our board books with absolutely no context. And I would hate for any of our districts to even think that, oh my God, things are changing before things have even really been implemented. And then my second part is, we're asking you to do a lot more work. And Ed, we're probably asking, and Rick, we're asking our staff to do a lot more work. What's the increase in the cost of having to present our valuations in this matter going forward?
Well, we haven't had that discussion with them, but they have a contract with us to provide a valuation at a certain price, so I don't even know when the contract expires.
Yeah, I think we got 2 more valuations under the contract.
Yeah, well, they can do it 2 more times.
So we can just
With, and we are bringing on another actuary, to
Right,
reports
to
to
help
Rick,
with
so
that.
that'll
That'll be
help on
good
that
too,
end.
yes.
I mean, we've increased the contract, I think, to relate to GASB. Obviously we can get a sense when, they haven't heard them scream at us yet about it, so we'll have to see. But right now we've
But I
got
can see
a.
Mark kicking you underneath the
No,
table.
no, no. See, you just ruined my negotiating. So, they have a contract for another 2 years, and it's a fixed rate for the valuation. So, if we'll have to see how complicated it is. The next valuation, quite honestly, could be even simpler than the old valuations, because we don't have to do the whole 1990 thing if you don't want to, because it doesn't change anything anymore until 2017-18.
Right.
So, it's
And
sort of up to you,
just
huh?
for historical perspective, I appreciate that we're making it actually now a policy that we're gonna do this every year. Because we used to do our evaluations every, what, 3
2
years?
years, 2
Every
years.
4 years, 2 years?
Yeah, and then he changed it every year
So
once we
for,
got
for the vast
serious.
majority of people on this board, we've been doing it every year for a long time.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we're putting that into policy.
Brian?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks.
very much. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Great job, guys.
How long is your presentation, Brian?
Certainly not as long as that. I have cartoons.
Oh, good.
I have it
'cause it's
scheduled
about
for,
that time of night.
I think 30 minutes. It's more of a walkthrough presentation. I can present it at any time.
Let's go in February,
Okay.
please.
Fine.
It's 5 o'clock, we have closed session. I think that a couple of those issues in closed session could really require a strong focus by folks. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
Works great for me.
Thank you, Brian.
They're awesome.
So, item 12A through F are consent items, but item 12A, oh, I'm sorry, Paul, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to take one thing off consent. just to
Sure.
add something.
Go ahead, Paul, what do you want to?
No, that's just the board member education.
Sure.
I'm gonna be going to an investment seminar at Stanford, and I don't know if Terry may be as well next week. But we've been trying to get information about at least the cost of the meals so we can get them reimbursed. So if we could just add that to the
Sure.
board member education, it's probably $200 to get,
Consider it done.
okay.
Not for Derek.
Hmm?
Not for Derek.
Not for Terry.
Can we take them separately?
We already stated.
So,
Robbie's
so the
our
board
coordinator.
education is amended so that Paul and Terry will be reimbursed for their travel to Stanford. Is it Stanford, Paul?
Yeah.
Next week to attend a conference. All right, so this consent is 12A is supposed to be read into the record, so I'll do that, if that's okay. And by direction of the Audits and Risks Management Committee, I move to accept the independent auditor's report on the CalSTRS financial statements for the year ended June 30th, 2014. And by the direction of the Risk Management Committee, I move to accept the independent auditor's report on the schedule of net pension liability, proportionate share of contributions, and schedule of aggregate pension amounts for employers and non-employer contributing entity for the year ended June 30th, 2014. Further, by the direction of the Audit Risk Management Committee, I move to accept the report to those charged with the governance from Crowe Howarth. And by the direction of the Audit Risk Management Committee, I move to accept the independent auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting and compliance and other matters for CalSTRS financial statements for the year ended June 30th, 2014. And finally, by direction of the committee, I move to accept the independent auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting and compliance and other matters for the schedule of proportionate share of contributions and schedule of aggregate pension amounts for employers and non-employer contributing entity for the year ended June 30th, 2014. There's one other item from the item 12 that has to be read into the record, and then we could just vote on all of them at once, if that's okay. That's, what is this, 12?
It's board governance, they're all 12A.
Oh, 12, oh yeah, it's board governance. By direction of the Board Governance Committee, I move adoption of a new CalSTRS Board Self-Evaluation Policy with amendments identified by the committee. And by the direction of the committee, I move adoption of the revised Board Governance Committee charter to expand the Board Governance Committee's ability to make recommendations on the format and organization of the policies in the Board Policy Manual. So that's 12.
We also have one for benefits and services.
We do, which number is that, Dana?
It's the second to last page.
Thanks. Thanks, Dana. By the direction of the Benefits and Services Committee, I move adoption of the recommendation to add policies regarding rates and benefits amounts to the Teachers' Retirement Board policy. So those are the only issues that have to be read into the record. So 12A through 12F are consent action items. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No? Okay, thank you. 13 is also a consent item, which is for informational purposes only. There's no action on that. Item 14 is items referred by the committee for board decision. Jennifer, do we have any? Okay. Didn't we talk to Ed about looking into providing educational opportunities regionally relative to,
CalSTRS College.
CalSTRS academies, and doing that before the end of the fiscal year. Okay, so we could,
And bringing actually investment management in-house and the benefits that will go with that.
right,
for-
great, thanks. And then I'd like to ask the board for support on a letter that I'd like the staff to draft on behalf to, as you know, we take pretty strong positions publicly and privately on social issues, on ESG. And although the United States has made great progress in the area of gay rights, it's a civil rights and human rights issue, we've made tremendous progress in that area, and we should be proud of that. There are many places in the world where people, for no other reason for being who they are imprisoned or are murdered for just being who they are. There's still a lot of places in the world that's where people are at. And because of the size of our institution and our commitment to Apple, it's our largest holding is Apple. It used to be Chevron, I believe, and now it's Apple. The fact that we're an educational fund, the largest teacher fund in the world, and that we should be teaching and embracing tolerance and acceptance of all people, regardless of where they are. It might be a one-off for some of us, but I think there's a lot of rationale as to why a letter from our board to Mr. Cook and the Apple board commending him for his courage to come out in Bloomberg and talk about who he is. I believe the readings that I've read in the Fortune 500 companies, only 3 top CEOs in Fortune 500 companies have openly gay or lesbian. And the reading that I've done on the issue is probably about 10% of the population is inherently gay or lesbian. So it's still an issue that's a global issue, it's a social issue. And we often point out companies that are doing social ills. Here's an example of social, for someone to come out in the way that he did. There's a position that he holds, who we are as an institution. I don't see that there's any downside in us writing to the Apple board and to Tim Cook, acknowledging what he did and commending him for what he did. So I'd like support from the board to direct staff to write that letter on our behalf.
So moved.
Thank you, Dana.
Second.
There's a second by Robbie. Any discussion on that or opposition? Okay, Maggie, before we vote.
Maggie, I was chair of CTO Advisory Committee. You know, as teachers, we stand up for our students. And this is something that's very dear. I'm going to do a Dana. To have the CalSTRS board write a letter on behalf of somebody, and what you stand for is diversity, and you're pushing for that diversity in corporations, and for me to be able to go back to council and put that in our minutes and tell council this is something that CalSTRS did would give me great pride. I think it's something that our organization, I would also, in my report today, report that back to asking our president to do the same thing. Students need to see grown-ups doing this. They need to see people in power having pride of who they are, and that it's okay to just be who you are. That's what we want our kids to do. And so I'm very proud that our board would do this, and I encourage you to vote yes in support of that letter. So thank you.
Thank you. And if we could CC our President Dean Vogel of the California Teachers Association on the letter. California Teachers Association has a very, very proud history of standing up for human rights, probably one of the leading organizations in this state, if not this country, for standing up for human and civil rights. And I feel so fortunate to be a part of that organization for what they stand in and what they believe in and what they fight for. And just on a personal note, and I don't want to belabor this issue, but one of my brothers is openly gay, and I come from a large family, an Irish Catholic family, and my father was in the Marine Corps, and that wasn't really something that, growing up was something you talked about in Queens, New York. And it wasn't until I was like in my early 20s, and I went and spent the Christmas holidays with my girlfriend at the time, with my brother in Fort Lauderdale, with all of his gay and lesbian friends, that I realized how awkward it meant. I felt like, wow, this must what it feels like to be actually feel different. Because we were like one of the only we were the only heterosexual couple at this holiday event, and I was like, wow, this is maybe how he feels amongst all of, when he's with everyone else. And the same thing when we marched in Gay Pride with David Sanchez, and I went out to support David and CTA, and they marched in Gay Pride, and I was with my fiancée at the time. And we spent the entire day, and then we looked at each other, and we were like, okay, time for us to go. We got to go. We got to be with our people now. But it was an educational, it was just my own education to the issue, and having two daughters, and who knows, what. And I want to be able to one day look at them and say, you just be whoever you are, and you're loved for who you are. So he's the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world right now, and he didn't have to do what he did, but he did, and I'm sure his board was aware of when he was going to do. And we should applaud that action in leadership. So that would be terrific. And thank you for the board, my colleagues, for supporting that. Thank you. Okay. Then we have. Oh, do we need a formal? No, we don't need one, Robbie. You seconded it. It's done. If you seconded it, Robbie, it's done.
Robbie.
Yeah, it's
Robbie
unanimous.
voted.
Unanimous.
It's a done deal. Get it done.
Thank you, Robbie. Thanks.
That's right, our proxies are- yeah.
New business items, review of information. Do we have anything? Jen? We just did it. Yeah, okay, thanks. The draft agenda for the next committee, we moved 2 items from today's agenda, Ed's report and Brian's report. Both will come back in February, right? Anything else there, Jack, that we want to move around, do you think? We're okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Opportunities for additional statements from the public? Okay, seeing none, we will adjourn into closed session. Is that correct, Brian? We're going to go to closed session now?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. So we'll take a 5-minute break